my childhood sucked. It sucked for various reasons. But my abusive butthole uncle is another reason why. People involved: me, female, 34, my middle brother, male, 32, abusive uncle, Uncle AA. My uncle was born the fourth child of an abusive father who just left them. To compensate for the crappy dad, my grandma tried to give all her kids anything they wanted, especially the youngest, Uncle AA. So Uncle AA never had to do anything his whole life, living with his mom in the house he grew up in until he died. He got every game and toy he ever wanted. He got double Star Wars figures, one to play with and one to keep pristine. He got every game console he wanted, at least 6 consoles, from Nintendo to PlayStation, and loads of games. He even had a huge video/DVD collection. Whenever we stayed with my grandma, me, my brother, and my mom, Uncle AA got whatever he wanted first. Special food? Yep. Can't share it either. He had sole control of the internet. My grandma and mom didn't know how to work it, and the box was in his room. If he was annoyed with us, he'd hide the TV remote or favor the one who didn't bug him in an obvious manner to upset the other. If he wanted something from some store, it became priority 1. He had to win all the games we played. If he didn't, he would shut the game off suddenly, making it so nobody won. But it gets worse. My uncle never had a job in his life. When he was a kid, he got a job delivering papers, but my grandma did the paper route every morning for a long while. Afterwards, he didn't bother getting another job. When he got old enough or something, never was told when he did this, he met with a physiology counselor about why he was disabled. He told the counselor that if he ever heard small children crying, he'd have to strangle them. And that he is too stressed out about it in general. So he was allowed for 30 years to collect disabilities in order to not work. He took money from my grandma, who was literally disabled. Her bones and muscles were degrading, making it so she couldn't walk, stand, or do much on her own, and made his mom, my grandma, do all the house chores and drive him around as he wanted. But all this is the tip of the iceberg. Really, he was much worse. He would get annoyed with me and my brother, and on 2 different occasions, threatened to blow us up. One time in a car, claiming there was a button for it near him, and the other time he claimed our belly button was the trigger. Yeah, obvious lies as a grown-up, but to 5 and 7-year-olds, very real. He would destroy anything we built with toys. He would demand we do as he said, and if anyone didn't, he'd physically hurt the person or try and guilt them into doing it. He tried to groom me into letting him touch inappropriate places. He spent years building up to something, but I realized something was wrong and started to try and distance myself from him. It started slow, as back scratches and allowed to sit on the bed with him right behind me. Then under the shirt scratches, and I noticed he was getting too happy with me sitting how I was. I didn't tell anyone because by then, I knew no one stopped him from doing whatever he wanted. But I did try to make sure he didn't do this to any of my siblings. And when I tried to stop hanging out with him, my grandma tried to guilt me into hanging with him. I tried to explain I didn't want to, but he would then pout and try to guilt me into doing so. It didn't work. I wrote them off when I moved out, but my other family members had to still deal with Uncle AA, as they wanted to help my grandma in her final years. He would shut the internet off any time they argued with him. He would steal money from them if he wanted something and they didn't want to pay for it, and try to pin some family members against others in stupid arguments that turned to high tension and bitterness in the house. When my grandma died, he sold off some of her things for money. He didn't tell any of the utilities that she had passed, and just didn't pay anything. It all finally caught up to him though, as my mom was doing that because it's the right thing to do. He eventually had to move out and take advantage of others to live his free life. Recently, he's asked my family to vouch for him to the government about how disabled he is. As we've all moved out from under his rule, we've all laughed, blocked his ass, and said no. So some good news? He may have to grow up. Who knows? Update 1. The first part honestly was very brief on the years and years of torture he did to everyone around him. Reminder, he is the youngest of 4, one of whom includes my mom. Everyone else grew up in much better shape than him, mentally and personality-wise. And even when my grandma tried to put down rules, far too late, he was already in control of the household. We'll start at earlier points. With his huge collection of toys and games, you'd think he'd have plenty of people who wanted to hang out with him. But he didn't. He had already ticked off his own friends and had to resort to playing with kids 1/3 his age that couldn't stop him from being mean and selfish. First, as young and small kids, between ages of 5 to 8/9-ish, we wrestled WWE style. But it wasn't fake moves. Luckily, he did put a pillow down under the one he pile drived, but the pins, punches, and throws were real. For leaf leg pin? Yep. Headlock, yes, but with the elbow and not forearm, fortunately. We stopped doing wrestling when I was tired of being pinned under a man 3 to 4 times my weight and puberty started to hit. It hit early. This is when he started to try and groom me, as I developed. Not done trying to physically play with us, he moved on to super soakers. While we had normal water, he put salt into his, and freely shot at our faces. Then we tried to fight with lightsabers, plastic extending ones. He pulled no punches with those either. Guess how many times we won? Never. The answer is never. By the time my brother and I were 9 or 10, me, female, and 7 to 8, brother, male, we moved on to video games because we couldn't handle the physical play. We barely won at these either. He had us play the games he wanted, which were fun games, but as soon as we started to figure out how to win or use characters that gave us a chance of winning, those options were closed and denied to us. Playing Mario Party, if we started to win, or were just about to win, he'd shut the game off mid-game. Once we started to prevent that, he got pouty and was a sore loser. He'd ignore or dismiss the winner and favor the loser. And when he won, he was still annoying. Side note, I had to spend literal years unlearning those bad habits of sore winning and sore losing. The entire time, he taught us to ignore our youngest sibling, F to M, younger than me by 9 years. I honestly have no idea what my sibling did during this time, because my uncle didn't care. He had 2 playmates who could keep up slightly with him. I will admit, I have always been a scaredy cat. Talk about zombies for not even 5 minutes, and I get nightmares that night. I will protect others to the bitter end, but in the case of it being just me, I dip. My uncle knew this and took advantage of it. At the tender ages of 7/8/9, while my brother was 2 years younger, he made us watch the following: Terminator, all first 3 movies. Tremors, the first 3. 8-Legged Freaks. IT, the old version. Gremlins, told you I was a scaredy cat. Sleepy Hollow. Blaze, the first 2? Hard to remember at this point. Evolution. The Mummy, Brendan Fraser ones. Hellboy. And many more. So many others. And my mom never knew. She tried to stop the first few, and then my uncle made us promise not to say. Since he didn't stop and no one stopped us, we figured he would just keep getting away with it. I still don't trust robots or AI. When I told her years later a 1/4 of the shit he did, she said she wished I told her. She would have stopped it or never gone back to live with our grandma for periods of time. While it's a sweet sentiment, I had already known nothing would have changed. After I put a stop to his attempted grooming, I tried to put distance between me and my uncle. But I literally had all grown-ups around me telling me how sad he was and how bored he was and he just wanted to play games. I tried to argue that I wanted to hang out with my grandma or anyone else, but she was already beaten down and just tried to get me to play games with him. So I did, but on my terms. Out in the living room, in separate chairs, and for limited amounts of time. We played board games and games on the living room TV, out of his little private chambers. And he could no longer bully me or my brother into letting him win. But he still had more practice than us, so he still won quite a lot anyways. By the time we moved out of PA and into VA in the USA, I was done with him. I no longer cared about him and most of my family who let him do as he pleased. But he still tried to guilt me and shame me for what I liked. Facebook started to be big for even us poorer folk who just got computers, mid-2000s, and when we posted about new interests, he was there. Trying to drag us down to his level. Got to the point where I would defend myself briefly, and then not message further. My mom and siblings didn't realize the true extent of his abuse and were still actively friendly. But this is just, again, a fraction of what shit he got up to. I'll make another about what he did to others in the next update. Update 2. The first part honestly was very brief on the years and years of torture he did to everyone around him. Reminder, he is the youngest of 4, one of whom includes my mom. Everyone else grew up in much better shape than him, mentally and personality-wise. And even when my grandma tried to put down rules, far too late, he was already in control of the household. While I was dealing with his abuse growing up, he's wormed his way to controlling the household. Uncle AA demanded the largest room of the tiny house my grandma owned, with a mortgage. He had the router, the part that gives internet to the rest of the house, in his room, and if anyone argued or tried to stop him, he'd removed the internet for everyone. So now whoever argued with him now had to deal with everyone else being mad because it wasn't Uncle A's fault. It was so and so, they made him do it. Then, he discovered my mom and siblings' social security numbers and would threaten to use it to make their lives difficult. How did he get them? He asked his mommy, of course. My grandma was getting older and older, and couldn't take care of everything, bills, paperwork, etc., and let him control those bits. So it made sense to her to give Uncle A that information. Of course, he never removed my grandma's name and info on those bills, so it couldn't lead to him if something went wrong. There were whole sections of the fridge we couldn't use / eat from, as it was his personal stash. But if you wanted something special? Nope, that was still fair game. My siblings, who are autistic, had to constantly deal with having no personal space, no personal food, and nowhere to hide from him. My grandma was in poor health. She was diabetic, and her very muscles and bones were degrading away. So she couldn't work after a while, and got disabilities. Most of her money went to bills and Uncle A's interests. We had to buy our own stuff with some minor things being shared. Even as she was in pain and had trouble standing. But Uncle A wouldn't do a lick of chore work, so she had to do everything: cook, clean, laundry, dishes, everything. My mom stayed with them to try and help eventually while I moved away. I wasn't going to stay in that shit situation. Well, my grandma was still doing chores, even as she had to use a walker and wheelchair. Uncle A didn't care and would bitch about the mess to her, expecting her to clean it up. He would even hit, pinch, or give rope burns to my disabled grandma. She had always owned dogs, and she had one dog who did not like when Uncle A did those things. The dog would growl and try to defend my grandma. Well, one day the dog had it with Uncle A's treatment of my grandma, and while he was hurting her, mildly, the dog bit him lightly, no breaks in the skin, no blood. Uncle A demanded that the dog be put down. The soonest possible. On my grandma's birthday. So my uncle had my grandma put her own dog down on her birthday. He didn't care. With that, he had the entire household listening to him. My mom has always owned cats and my grandma still owned a cat. They were the next targets of his abuse if the others didn't do as he wanted. He would gaslight, argue, guilt trip, and threaten to get whatever he wanted. He tried to start fights between my mom and siblings and my grandma and great-uncle who sometimes lived there as well. This would take the form of lying about what happened or who said what. Then lying when the other side would ask what he said. This made everything worse, and tense, and made my mom's efforts of trying to help her mom worthless at times. He didn't stop any of this behavior, even after my grandma suddenly passed away. Since his name wasn't on any of the bills, his credit score didn't suffer from missed payments, as he didn't pay anyone anything. Not the bills, the mortgage, not even for the funeral of his own mother. My mom had to get a loan for the funeral from the funeral home, and I had to go up and help them for almost 2 weeks. But as my grandma was gone, as was my great-uncle, and no one else needed her, my mom and siblings were able to move away from the abuse. He still kept in contact via social media, because they didn't realize what he had tried to do when I was younger. He tried to force their help by holding their possessions hostage. They helped briefly and then stopped once they got their things, or at least the most important stuff. Then they stopped doing so. He tried to bribe them with accounts to watch TV and movies from, but as a way to find their address and payment info. They didn't take the bait. He came down from PA to where my mom was living with their things, and tried to get money from them. And tried to scope out if there was room for him to live there too. He even asked if there was room where I was living for him to move in. There wasn't, and there was no way in hell would I allow that. When he visited, he threatened to hit my mom's bad leg that had surgery done on it, and in a special metal fixation. I swear I saw red and almost pew-pewed him. I was there to be sure he didn't try anything, because if her leg got injured while recovering, she would lose the leg and any chance to get it fixed. It was after that point when he left that I told my mom what he had actually been doing when we were growing up. She was horrified and told my siblings to cut all contact and block him. It only partially worked, as he knew an address to send mail to. So when he tried to request help with lying to the government about how disabled he was, it was promptly ignored and left in the wind. From last I know, he is taking advantage of others' goodwill and using their good names to get places to stay with minimal effort or pay. He's such a leech and lump on the log that he's wrecked those contacts as well, from what I know. But I've not cared about him for 5+ years, so no idea since.